The Missouri River was a mirror of liquid silver under the pre-dawn light of June 2nd, 1823, but the air held a stillness that felt like a held breath. On the sandy banks near the Arikara villages, 90-some fur traders, men hardened by the elements and fueled by the promise of beaver gold, slept fitfully beside their picket lines. Among them was a young, as of yet unknown Jedediah Smith and the veteran William Ashley. The peace was not merely quiet, it was brittle. For days, tensions had simmered over traded horses and perceived slights. But as the first grey sliver of morning broke over the Dakotas, the silence didn't break, it shattered. A single musket shot rang out from the high mud-walled embankments of the Ree villages, followed instantly by a rhythmic rolling thunder of heavy gunfire that turned the riverbank into a slaughterhouse of screaming horses and dying men. Before we continue our journey into the wild, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? The transition from sleep to survival was a matter of heartbeats, but for many of Ashley's men, those heartbeats were their last. The Arikara had the high ground, perched behind fortified timber palisades that overlooked the narrow strip of beach where the trappers had camped to guard their newly purchased horses. Lead balls whistled through the air with a terrifying thwip crack, tearing through canvas tents and finding purchase in the chests of men who hadn't even reached for their rifles. The Missouri River, usually the lifeline of the fur trade, suddenly became a watery wall at their backs. To the front was a storm of fire, to the rear a cold, deep current that offered only a different kind of death. General William Ashley, watching from the safety of the keelboats anchored mid-river, could only scream orders over the cacophony, his voice lost to the roar of the ambush. On the shore, the chaos was absolute. The horses, terrified by the scent of blood and the concussive blasts of gunpowder, bucked and tore at their tethers, trampling the wounded in a frantic bid for freedom. Jedediah Smith, showing the steel that would later make him a legend, rallied a small group of trappers to return fire, but they were shooting at shadows behind mud walls. The Arikara marksmen were methodical, picking off the land party with chilling precision. Blood soaked into the thirsty sand of the Missouri, turning the shoreline into a slick crimson mire. Men scrambled for the two small skiffs that were meant to ferry them to the larger keelboats, but the weight of the panicked survivors threatened to capsize the tiny vessels before they even left the shallows. The water around the skiffs erupted in miniature geysers as the Arikara shifted their focus to the retreating boats. Those who couldn't fit into the skiffs were forced to make a choice: die on the sand or plunge into the Missouri's unforgiving embrace. The river, swollen with spring melt, swept men downstream as they struggled to swim in heavy buckskins and boots. The sound of the conflict was a haunting melody of high-pitched war cries, the guttural moans of the dying, and the relentless boom log of the heavy Northwest trade guns. It was no longer a battle. It was a desperate, panicked flight for existence against an enemy that had decided the Missouri River was closed to the white man's commerce. Edward Rose, the translator who had warned of this very outcome, moved through the smoke like a specter, his face a mask of grim realization. He knew the Arikara, their grievances, their strength, and their tactical brilliance in defending their home. As he helped shove a skiff into the current, he watched as the shore party was whittled down to a handful of desperate souls. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company was being decapitated in its infancy. The grand dreams of reaching the beaver-rich streams of the West were sinking into the mud alongside the bodies of nearly 15 men. The Missouri, the great highway of the frontier, had turned into a gauntlet of lead and bone. Amidst the whistling lead, the courage of a few prevented a total massacre. Men like Smith and the veteran trapper John Kleiman stood their ground in the shallows, firing until their barrels were too hot to touch, providing the precious seconds needed for the last skiff to push off. They were waist-deep in the cold water, the surface around them hissing as bullets struck the river. The screams of the wounded left behind on the sand would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, a jagged reminder of the price of the frontier. When the skiffs finally reached the safety of the Yellowstone and the Rocky Mountains keelboats, the decks were quickly slicked with the gore of the rescued, and the air was thick with the smell of sulfur and fear. By the time the sun had fully risen, the firing from the villages had tapered off into a mocking silence. The Arikara remained behind their walls, victorious and defiant. On the keelboats, the survivors huddled in shock. They were a broken force, their horses gone, their comrades dead, and their spirits shattered by the sheer ferocity of the assault. William Ashley, a man who had staked his entire fortune on this expedition, looked out at the river and realized the world had changed. The traditional route to the mountains, the water route established by Lewis and Clark, was now a graveyard. The gate was shut, and the key had been thrown into the Missouri. This defeat was the turning point in the history of the American West. It wasn't just a lost battle, it was a fundamental shift in how the wilderness would be conquered. The trappers could no longer rely on the easy passage of the river or the hospitality of the tribes along its banks. The ambush at the Arikara villages forced a hard, cold look at the map. If they were to survive and thrive, they would have to turn their backs on the water and face the vast, unknown interior of the continent on foot and horseback. The legend of the mountain man, the solitary land-bound wanderer, was born in the blood and fire of this June morning. The days leading up to the massacre had been deceptively peaceful, painted in the golden hues of a late spring on the upper Missouri. To look at the landscape was to see a paradise of rolling grasslands, shifting sandbars, and the endless sapphire sky of the Dakotas. The two keelboats, the Rocky Mountain and the Yellowstone, had made grueling progress upstream, their crews leaning into the heavy poles, muscles straining against the Missouri's relentless, big muddy current. Along the banks, the cottonwood trees flickered with new leaves, and the air was filled with the scent of damp earth and wild sage. It was the kind of beauty that lulled a man into a false sense of security, masking the fact that they were encroaching on the sovereign territory of the most formidable power in the region. The Arikara villages were a marvel of frontier engineering. Sprawling complexes of earth lodges, each shaped like a massive mound of sun-baked clay and timber, surrounded by a formidable trench and a high, sharpened palisade. To the trappers, these villages looked like ancient hives, buzzing with activity. Thousands of people lived here, perched on the bluffs to control the flow of trade. As Ashley's party arrived, the scene was one of bustling commerce rather than war. Women tended to crops of corn, beans, and squash in the bottomlands, while the men moved with a quiet, observant dignity. For a moment, it seemed as though the middlemen of the Missouri were ready to do business, their hands open for trade rather than clenched around the grips of their war clubs. General William Ashley, a man of soaring ambition and refined sensibilities, saw the Arikara not as an army, but as a hurdle to be cleared with diplomacy and trade goods. He was a businessman in a land that didn't recognize his ledgers. He spent hours in the cool, dim interiors of the earth lodges, smoking the pipe with the chiefs, exchanging knives, beads, and gunpowder for the horses he desperately needed to transport his supplies overland. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of roasting meat and the rhythmic sounds of village life. There were laughs, shared meals, and the cautious curiosity of two cultures meeting on the edge of the world. Ashley believed he had secured a pact. He believed the Missouri was his to traverse. Among the trappers, however, the mood was more guarded. Men like the black trapper Edward Rose, who had lived among the Crow and knew the nuances of tribal politics, sensed a vibration of hostility beneath the surface. He watched the way the young Arikara warriors looked at the white men, not with awe, but with a calculating coldness. There was a grievance brewing, rooted in the death of an Arikara chief's son during a previous encounter with another company and the shifting alliances of the fur trade. While the leaders talked of peace, the warriors were sharpening their lances and cleaning their British-made muskets. The air in the camp grew heavy, not with the heat of the sun, but with the static of an impending storm. The nights were particularly beautiful, yet unsettling. The trappers on the shore camped in a crescent moon shape around their new horses, the campfire light flickering off the polished wood of their long rifles. Across the water, the Arikara villages glowed with their own fires, and the sound of drumming would occasionally drift across the river. A low, rhythmic thumping that felt like the heartbeat of the land itself. The stars above were so bright they seemed to cast shadows, and the Missouri gurgled softly against the hulls of the keelboats. It was a scene of profound stillness, a momentary truce between the advancing tide of westward expansion and the ancient defenders of the river. Jedediah Smith, only 24 and deeply religious, likely spent those quiet hours reading his Bible by the embers. He was a different breed of mountain man, one who didn't drink or swear, but who possessed a quiet intensity that commanded respect. In the stillness, he would have looked at the high mud walls of the villages and understood the precariousness of their position. They were deep in the Indian country, hundreds of miles from the nearest military outpost, separated from safety by a river that could turn into a trap at any moment. The beauty of the Dakota Plains was a thin veil, and Smith was one of the few who realized how easily it could be torn away. The day before the attack, a heavy, humid heat settled over the valley. The trade was complete, the horses were secured, and Ashley planned to move out the following morning. But a final disagreement over the price of a horse and a series of insults exchanged between a few trappers and some Arikara braves poisoned the final hours of the peace. The Ree felt cheated and disrespected. The Americans felt entitled and secure. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and orange, the Arikara chiefs withdrew into their lodges. The trade gates were closed. The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of peace, but the silence of the hunt. As the fires died down to white ash, the 19th century frontier looked as it always had, vast, indifferent, and majestic. But inside the Arikara palisades, 300 warriors were checking their flintlocks. On the beach, 90 men slept, dreaming of the beaver-rich streams of the Yellowstone, unaware that the ground beneath them was about to erupt. The contrast between the serene beauty of the Missouri and the butchery that was hours away remains one of the most haunting chapters of the American West. The Big Muddy continued to flow, cold and deep, carrying the weight of a history that was about to be written in lead. The morning of June 2nd didn't arrive with a sunrise. It arrived with a funeral shroud of gray fog that clung to the Missouri like a wet wool blanket. In those final agonizing minutes before the first shot, the world felt distorted. The familiar sounds of the river, the lapping water, the rustle of cottonwoods were swallowed by a heavy, unnatural pressure in the air. The trappers on the beach began to stir, their joints stiff from the damp sand, reaching for their boots and their coffee pots. But there was no birdsong. There was no movement from the Arikara villages on the heights. The earth lodges sat like silent, watchful tombs, their smoke holes cold. It was a silence that screamed. The dread began as a low-level vibration in the soles of their feet. On the shore, the horses were the first to know. They didn't just whinny, they let out a series of shrill, panicked cries, their eyes rolling back to show the whites as they strained against their pickets. They could smell the adrenaline and the metallic tang of oiled gun barrels from behind the palisades. Jedediah Smith stood up, narrowing his eyes against the mist, his hand instinctively dropping to the lock of his rifle. He saw a flicker of movement, a glint of brass, the shift of a feathered headpiece high on the mud walls. In that instant, the realization hit him like a physical blow. They weren't just being watched, they were being sighted. There is a specific kind of horror in knowing you are trapped before the trap actually springs. The men on the beach were caught in a killing zone. a narrow strip of exposed sand, flanked by the impassable river on one side and the fortified high ground on the other. They were naked to the world. A few veteran trappers started to shout, their voices cracking the morning stillness, telling men to get to the skiffs. But it was too late. The Arikara hadn't just gathered a few warriors, they had lined the entire length of their walls with hundreds of marksmen. The dread that had been simmering for days finally boiled over into a cold, paralyzing certainty. They were meant to die here. Suddenly, the silence was ripped apart by a sound that one survivor later described as the very gates of hell swinging open. It wasn't a ragged volley. It was a synchronized sheet of flame from the Arikara line. The first wave of lead didn't just hit the camp, it leveled it. Tents were shredded into confetti. The heavy trade balls, nearly an inch in diameter, struck the horses with the sound of hammers hitting wet wood. The animals collapsed in screaming heaps, their thrashing legs breaking the limbs of the men trying to hide behind them. The air was suddenly thick with the acrid, choking stench of black powder smoke, turning the morning fog into a blinding, sulphurous haze. The psychological toll of the next 10 minutes was more devastating than the physical wounds. The trappers were used to the Indian wars of the woods, skirmishes, ambushes, and hit-and-run tactics. They were not prepared for this, a disciplined, sustained bombardment from a fortified position. They were being hunted like livestock in a pen. Every time a man tried to rise to return fire, 3 or 4 balls would hiss past his head or thud into the sand at his feet. The Arikara were not screaming or charging. They were coolly, methodically reloading and firing, their positions almost entirely invisible behind the thick timber of the palisades. It was a mechanical, relentless slaughter. On the keelboats, General Ashley stood paralyzed by the sight of his men being picked apart. He ordered his small swivel guns, miniature cannons, to be readied, but the distance and the angle made them nearly useless against the mud walls. He watched through the smoke as his friends and employees were bowled over like pins. One man, his bowels opened by a shot, crawled toward the water, leaving a dark trail on the sand that the river instantly licked away. Another was seen standing perfectly still, his rifle unfired, his face a mask of total catatonic shock until a ball struck him square in the forehead. The dread had transitioned into a waking nightmare, where the only logic was the whistle of lead. The water, which they had hoped would be their escape, now looked like a boiling cauldron. As the skiffs were launched, the Arikara shifted their fire, the lead splatting into the Missouri with the sound of heavy rain. The men who dove into the river found the current was their enemy, pulling them downstream and away from the boats, leaving them bobbing targets for the marksmen on the bluffs. The river was no longer a path, it was a graveyard. Every splash was a desperate prayer, every stroke a gamble against a bullet. The overwhelming feeling among the survivors wasn't anger, it was a profound, hollow helplessness. As the chapter of the Missouri River trade closed in blood, the survivors realized they weren't just fighting for their lives. They were witnessing the end of an era. The Arikara had sent a message that echoed all the way back to St. Louis. The great highway was closed. The dread that settled over the men as they drifted downstream, leaving their dead unburied on the sand, was the realization that the wilderness was far more savage, far more organized, and far more protective of its secrets than they had ever dared to imagine. They were no longer the conquerors of the West, they were its prey. The sky above the Missouri was no longer gray, it was a bruised, sickly yellow, choked with the rolling clouds of black powder smoke that refused to dissipate in the humid morning air. This was the moment where the legend of the American mountain man was forged, not in a moment of triumph, but in a desperate, screaming struggle for a single inch of survival. The beach had become a butcher's yard. Men were no longer standing, they were crawling through a slurry of sand, horse gore, and spent lead. The sound was a physical weight. The bone-shaking thrum of the heavy muskets, the high-pitched shriek of wounded stallions, and the rhythmic, guttural war cries of the Arikara that seemed to vibrate from the very earth itself. In the center of this hurricane stood Jedediah Smith. At only 24, he was a man of quiet prayer, but on this day, his prayer was written in gunpowder. While others were paralyzed by the sheer volume of fire, Smith moved with a terrifying, cold clarity. He stood tall amidst the whistling lid, a target that should have been struck a dozen times over, his long rifle barking back at the flashes on the bluffs. He was the anchor. He grabbed men by their collars, hauling them upward, shouting over the roar to get them toward the water. "To the boats!" he roared, his voice a jagged edge against the chaos. Around him, his companions were falling like wheat before a scythe. He saw his friends, men he had shared meat and stories with just hours before, folded in half by the impact of heavy trade balls, their lives leaking into the thirsty Missouri soil. The skiffs, the only hope for salvation, were a scene of absolute, primitive desperation. As the two small boats touched the shore, the panicked survivors surged forward. There was no order, only the raw, animal instinct to live. Men fought one another to climb over the gunwales, the wood slick with blood and river water. The skiffs groaned under the weight, dipping dangerously low in the water. From the heights, the Arikara saw the cluster of targets and redoubled their fire. The river around the boats hissed and boiled as hundreds of lead balls pelted the surface. It was a gauntlet of fire that seemed impossible to breach. One skiff, overloaded and caught in the crossfire, began to drift. Its oarsmen shot dead in their seats, their bodies slumped over the oars like broken puppets. Then came the moment of ultimate sacrifice. A small group of forlorn hope trappers, realizing the skiffs would be sunk if the fire wasn't suppressed, refused to board. They stayed on the blood-soaked sand, kneeling behind the carcasses of dead horses, providing a final desperate cover. Among them was the veteran John Kleiman. He watched as the Arikara warriors, emboldened by their victory, began to swarm out from behind their walls, descending the slopes like a mountain slide of paint and steel. The transition from a distance fight to a hand-to-hand massacre was seconds away. The air was filled with the metallic tink of ramrods hitting barrels as the trappers reloaded with shaking hands, knowing they were counting down their final seconds of life. The water became a sanctuary and a trap simultaneously. Men who couldn't reach the boats threw themselves into the Missouri. The cold shock of the mountain-fed water was a jolt to the system. But the river offered no easy escape. The current was a living thing, a powerful, swirling beast that dragged men under. Survivors looked back to see their comrades standing on the shore, obscured by smoke, firing one last volley before being overrun by the wave of Arikara warriors. The screams that drifted across the water were not of fear, but of an agonizing finality. One trapper, Reed Gibson, was hit in the water. His friends watched helplessly as the Missouri turned a deep, blossoming crimson around him before the current swept his body away toward the hidden sandbars downstream. On the keelboats, General Ashley was a man possessed by grief and horror. He paced the deck, screaming for the oarsmen to hold steady, to not let the larger boats drift away from the men still struggling in the water. He was witnessing the total annihilation of his company, the death of his dreams, and the slaughter of his men. The swivel guns finally found their range, sending a spray of grape shot toward the shoreline to push back the advancing warriors, the concussive blast shaking the very timber of the boats. The smoke was so thick now that the sun was a mere ghost in the sky, a pale disk watching a massacre. Finally, the last skiff pulled away, a floating morgue of wounded and dying men. The rowers pulled with a strength born of pure terror, their muscles screaming, their eyes fixed on the safety of the keelboats mid-river. As they pulled back, the beach was revealed, a horrifying tableau of the price of the frontier. 12 men lay dead on the sand. 11 more were hideously wounded. The horses, the very reason for the stop, lay in a tangled mess of leather and bone. The Arikara stood on the shore, their muskets raised in triumph, their silhouettes dark against the burning horizon of the Dakota plains. They had won. They hadn't just defeated an expedition, they had broken the spirit of the river trade. The retreat was not a quiet affair. As the keelboats began to drift downstream, away from the scene of the slaughter, A heavy, oppressive silence finally fell over the men. The only sounds were the groans of the wounded and the rhythmic splash of the oars. Jedediah Smith, his buckskins splattered with the blood of his brothers, knelt on the deck and did something that stunned the hardened survivors. He began to pray aloud. His voice, steady and resonant, rose above the sound of the river, asking for mercy for the dead and strength for the living. In that moment of absolute defeat, the mountain man was no longer just a fur trapper. He was a survivor of a baptism of fire that would redirect the course of American history. The Missouri was closed, but the spirit of the men who survived it was now a hardened steel, ready to find a new way through the heart of the continent. The Missouri River carried the defeated expedition downstream, but it could not wash away the grim reality of what had transpired. The Arikara ambush resulted in the deaths of 15 men and the wounding of nearly a dozen more, the heaviest loss ever suffered by an American fur trading party up to that time. As the keelboats drifted into the safety of the lower reaches, the atmosphere was thick with a somber, transformative weight. General William Ashley's grand plan to dominate the river trade lay in ruins, his capital spent, and his workforce decimated. However, in the shadows of this catastrophe, the survivors were forced to innovate. They realized that the Missouri, once the undisputed highway of the West, was now a corridor of death controlled by powerful nations who did not want them there. It was Jedediah Smith who stepped forward to bridge the gap between failure and legend. With the river route blocked, he proposed a radical alternative: abandon the boats and strike out overland. This decision changed everything. By turning their backs on the Missouri, these men, now truly mountain men, discovered the South Pass in Wyoming, a broad, gentle gap in the Rocky Mountains that allowed wagons and horses to cross the continental divide. The blood spilled at the Arikara villages became the catalyst for the opening of the Oregon Trail. The ambush didn't stop the westward expansion. It simply forced it off the water and onto the dusty, rugged trails that would eventually define the American spirit. The survivors of that bloody June morning became the vanguard of a new era. They learned that survival in the 19th century frontier required more than just grit. It required an adaptability that bordered on the supernatural. They became shadows in the sagebrush, masters of the high peaks, and the first to see the wonders of the Yellowstone and the Great Salt Lake. The tragedy at the Ree villages served as a brutal lesson that the wilderness would not be bargained with. It had to be understood on its own terms. The ghosts of the men left on that sandy beach remained as silent sentinels, marking the spot where the old way of the frontier died and the era of the mountain man began. As the sun sets over the rugged breaks of the Missouri today, the landscape remains largely unchanged, a vast and rolling testament to the struggles of those who came before. The story of the Arikara ambush is a reminder that history is not just a series of dates, but a collection of desperate moments and courageous choices made under fire. It is the story of how a crushing defeat gave birth to the greatest migration in human history. The Big Muddy still flows, carrying the echoes of the shots fired in 1823, a permanent mark on the soul of the American West. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us here at Wildbound History. If you believe the spirit of the frontier still lives, hit the like button and subscribe for our next survival story. Until next time, stay wild.